Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in Sicily, a poor island where power belonged to men with knives, silence, and reputation. His family immigrated to New York when he was a child, settling into the violent chaos of the Lower East Side. Luciano learned early that the streets had their own rules. School didn't matter, the law didn't protect you. Respect was everything, and respect was taken, not given. By his teens, Luciano was already running extortion rackets, shaking down kids for pennies, beating anyone who refused to pay. He wasn't the strongest, and he wasn't the loudest, but he was observant. He watched how men rose and how they fell. He noticed one thing above all else: the old world mafia way of doing business was broken. At the time, Italian crime families were ruled by stubborn, tradition-obsessed bosses who cared more about bloodlines and Sicilian customs than money. They refused to work with Jews, Irish, or anyone outside their villages. They settled disputes with blood instead of strategy. Luciano hated that. He didn't believe crime should be emotional. He believed it should be organized, efficient, and profitable. To him, crime wasn't about honor, it was about business. And business didn't care where you came from, only whether you delivered results. Luciano surrounded himself with men who thought the same way. Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster with a brilliant mind for numbers. Bugsy Siegel, reckless but fearless. Frank Costello, calm and politically connected. Together they represented something new, a generation that didn't care about old grudges or ancient rules. They cared about power that lasted. Luciano began building alliances across ethnic lines, creating networks instead of gangs, systems instead of street wars. This alone made him dangerous, but it also made him a target. The biggest obstacle in Luciano's way was the man who ruled New York's Italian underworld, Joe the Boss Masseria. Masseria represented everything Luciano hated. He was greedy, paranoid, obsessed with tradition, and blind to change. The city was heading toward a violent civil war between Masseria and rival boss Salvatore Maranzano. Luciano was caught in the middle, pretending loyalty while quietly planning the future. He understood something crucial. The war wasn't about who would win. It was about ending the war forever. Luciano made the boldest move in mafia history. He betrayed his own boss. In 1931, he set up a lunch meeting with Masseria at a restaurant in Coney Island. While they played cards, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Seconds later, gunmen walked in and emptied their weapons into Masseria. The old boss was dead, but Luciano wasn't done. He then turned on Maranzano as well, arranging his assassination months later. In 1 year, Luciano eliminated the two most powerful mafia leaders in America without firing a single shot himself. What followed changed crime forever. Instead of crowning himself boss of bosses, Luciano abolished the title entirely. He created something revolutionary: the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the major crime families, designed to settle disputes, approve murders, and prevent wars. Each family had territory. Each family had rules. Violence became controlled. Profits exploded. Luciano didn't just run a crime family. He built a corporate structure for organized crime that still exists today. Under Luciano's system, the mafia became invisible and unstoppable. No flashy killings, no public wars, just money flowing quietly through gambling, unions, construction, drugs, and politics. Luciano himself lived comfortably, avoiding attention, letting others take the spotlight. He believed the smartest criminals were the ones nobody noticed. And for a while, it worked. Luciano became the most powerful crime figure in America without most people knowing his name. But silence doesn't make you invincible. It only delays the consequences. The man who would bring Luciano down wasn't a gangster. It was a prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. Dewey couldn't prove Luciano ordered murders. He couldn't tie him directly to drugs. So he attacked the structure itself. In 1936, Dewey charged Luciano with running a massive prostitution operation across New York. It didn't matter whether the accusations fully stuck. The jury was terrified. The public wanted a villain. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The architect of modern crime was silenced overnight. From prison, Luciano watched as the empire he built continued without him. His system worked too well. The families followed the rules, the money kept flowing. He had made himself replaceable, and that was the irony. His greatest achievement ensured his own irrelevance. During World War II, the U.S. government secretly worked with Luciano to secure the docks and assist with the invasion of Sicily. In exchange, his sentence was commuted. But there was a catch. Luciano would never be allowed to return to the United States. He was deported to Italy, a country he barely remembered. The man who once controlled New York now lived in exile. No throne, no territory, no authority. From Naples, Luciano tried to maintain influence, but the distance weakened him. Younger bosses rose. New alliances formed. The world moved on. He spent his final years watching the empire he created from the outside, knowing it would never truly be his again. Lucky Luciano died in 1962 of a heart attack at an airport in Naples, waiting to meet a movie producer who wanted to tell his story. He died quietly, far from the streets that made him powerful. No gunshots, no betrayal, just silence. And that silence is his legacy. Lucky Luciano proved that crime didn't need tradition to survive. It needed structure. He showed that power didn't come from fear alone, but from organization, patience, and intelligence. He built a system so effective that it outlived him. But in doing so, he eras himself from the center of it. He changed crime forever, and then disappeared into the background of his own creation. The world remembers the loud gangsters, the flashy ones, the men who died violently. But Lucky Luciano was something different. He was the man who understood that the most dangerous power is the kind that doesn't announce itself. And in the end, the man who mastered silence was destroyed by it. After Luciano's death, the world slowly began to understand what he had really done. The mafia didn't collapse when he was arrested. It didn't fall apart when he was deported. It didn't even weaken when he died alone in Naples. That was the proof. Luciano had succeeded too well. He had removed emotion, ego, and tradition from crime and replaced them with systems. The bosses who came after him didn't need to be visionaries. They just needed to follow the blueprint. Meetings replaced wars. Percentages replaced revenge. Silence replaced speeches. The underworld became quieter, richer, and far more dangerous. Ironically, the very thing Luciano believed would protect him became the reason no one fought for him. When he went to prison, there were no riots, no bloodshed, no dramatic retaliation. The families adjusted. Business continued. Luciano had taught them how to operate without any single man being indispensable. In the old days, killing a boss caused chaos. Under Luciano's system, removing the boss caused paperwork. That was progress in his mind. But progress came with a cost. He had built a machine, and machines don't feel loyalty. From Italy, Luciano tried to reinsert himself into the world he created. He hosted meetings, he sent messages through intermediaries, he offered advice. But power is physical. It needs presence. The men running New York had never felt the hunger Luciano had known as a child. They inherited stability, money, and influence. To them, Luciano wasn't a king. He was history, useful, respected, but no longer necessary. And Luciano knew it. He never complained publicly, but those close to him said the exile hurt more than prison ever did. The silence followed him everywhere. He couldn't return to the United States. He couldn't walk the streets he once owned. He couldn't sit at the tables where decisions were made. He watched younger, louder men make mistakes he would have prevented. He saw violence return in flashes where discipline slipped, but no one asked him to fix it. His role was over. The architect had been locked out of his own building. That is the final irony of Lucky Luciano. He didn't lose because he was reckless. He didn't lose because he trusted the wrong people. He lost because he was too effective. He proved that crime could survive without kings, without titles, without emotion. And once that truth existed, there was no room left for him at the center. The system he designed demanded anonymity, and in the end, it swallowed its creator. Luciano once believed that being invisible was the safest way to live. He was right. But invisibility also means being forgotten while still alive. He changed crime forever, not with violence, but with structure. And when his time came, there were no enemies left to kill him, no allies left to save him, and no empire left that truly belonged to him. just silence. Years later, law enforcement agencies, historians, and even rival criminals would quietly admit the truth they never said out loud while Luciano was alive. Every modern criminal organization, whether they hated him or not, was standing on his shoulders. Drug cartels, crime syndicates, even white-collar criminal networks followed the same principles Luciano introduced: decentralization, compartmentalization, silence, and profit over pride. Killings became liabilities, attention became poison, ego became weakness. Luciano had turned crime into an operating system, and once installed, it could run without him forever. But Luciano himself never enjoyed the peace that system created. In Italy, he lived under constant surveillance, always watched, always restricted, always reminded that the country he helped during the war still didn't trust him. He wasn't allowed to return to the only place that ever felt like home. The streets of New York had made him powerful, but they were also the one thing he was never allowed to see again. Friends aged, died, or moved on, names changed, faces disappeared. The city evolved without him, and Luciano remained frozen in time, a ghost who was still breathing. There is something deeply tragic about a man who wins the game by rewriting the rules, only to be banned from playing afterward. Luciano didn't die in a hail of bullets. He didn't die betrayed by his closest allies. He died waiting, quietly, with a lifetime of decisions echoing in his head. He had built a world where crime no longer needed legends, and that meant there was no place left for legends like him. And maybe that was the price. Luciano didn't want fame. He didn't want statues. He wanted efficiency. He wanted longevity. He wanted crime to outlive emotion. He got exactly what he asked for. The mafia survived, the structure survived, the money survived. Only he faded away. That is why Lucky Luciano's story isn't about violence or glory. It's about sacrifice in its coldest form. He sacrificed recognition for stability. He sacrificed control for order. He sacrificed himself so the system could live on. And in doing so, he proved the most unsettling truth of power: the strongest structures erase the people who build them. Lucky Luciano changed crime forever. And then the world he built went silent around him. As time passed, Luciano's name became something spoken in back rooms rather than headlines. The men who followed his blueprint rarely mentioned him publicly, not out of disrespect, but because mentioning architects invites questions, and questions are dangerous. Luciano had taught them that too. The perfect criminal system doesn't celebrate its founder. It buries him under routine, procedure, and habit. The younger bosses grew up inside a world Luciano created, but they didn't feel gratitude. They felt entitlement. To them, this was just how things were supposed to work. Meanwhile, law enforcement quietly studied his methods the same way generals study enemy tactics. The commission became a case study: the structure of families, the separation of roles, the insulation of leadership from violence. All of it forced police to rethink how crime could be fought. Luciano didn't just change criminals. He changed cops, courts, and governments. Entire task forces were built to deal with the kind of invisible power he introduced: wiretaps, informants, long-term investigations, all responses to a system that refused to expose itself. And yet none of that reached Luciano in the way it mattered. Sitting in Italy, he lived a life stripped of context. Power without territory is meaningless. Influence without presence fades. He could give advice, but he couldn't enforce it. He could suggest alliances, but he couldn't guarantee loyalty. Every year that passed made him less relevant, not because his ideas were outdated, but because they had become normal. When everyone thinks the way you once did, you stop being special. Those who knew him personally said Luciano became quieter with age. Not bitter, not angry, just reflective. He understood the irony. He had destroyed the concept of the untouchable boss, and in doing so, he made himself untouchable in the worst way. Unreachable, unneeded, isolated. He had once believed that removing emotion from crime would make it safer, but he learned too late that removing emotion from life leaves you alone. The greatest punishment Luciano ever faced wasn't prison. It wasn't exile. It was watching others live comfortably inside a world he could no longer enter. The dinners, the meetings, the decisions that shaped millions, all of it happened without him. He had turned crime into a machine, and machines don't look back to thank their creators. In the end, Lucky Luciano didn't lose his empire. He gave it away piece by piece in exchange for stability, order, and silence. And silence is exactly what he received. No legacy carved in stone, no throne to pass down, just a system that worked so well it erased the need for the man who built it. That is why his story still matters, not because of what he took, or who he killed, or how much money he made, but because he proved that true power doesn't roar. It hums quietly in the background, unnoticed, unquestioned, unstoppable, and the men who build that kind of power rarely get to enjoy it. Lucky Luciano changed crime forever, and the price he paid wasn't blood. It was being remembered only as a shadow behind everything that came after. Even decades later, Luciano's influence could be felt in the mistakes others made by forgetting his rules. Whenever a boss became too loud, too visible, too obsessed with his own image, the system corrected itself. Arrests followed, informants appeared, empires collapsed. And quietly, Luciano's philosophy proved itself again and again. Power was never meant to be displayed, it was meant to be hidden. Those who ignored that lesson paid quickly. Those who followed it survived quietly. What makes Luciano's story different from every gangster who came after him is that he understood the end from the beginning. He never believed crime was eternal. He knew it was temporary, fragile, always one mistake away from collapse. That's why he didn't build monuments. He built exits, layers, buffers, distance. He designed a world where no single arrest could bring everything down. And ironically, that meant when he fell, there was nothing dramatic about it. No revenge, no retaliation, just continuation. There's something almost philosophical about the way his life ended. A man obsessed with order died in a world that no longer needed him to maintain it. A man who believed in silence was swallowed by it. The newspapers didn't chase his final years. The public didn't fear his name anymore. But behind closed doors, among people who truly understood power, Luciano was never forgotten. He became a reference point, a warning, a lesson. You can rule loudly and die young, or rule quietly and disappear while still breathing. Luciano chose the second path, and it cost him the thing he never admitted he wanted, acknowledgement. He wanted to matter without being seen, and in the end he mattered so much that he vanished from the story entirely. That is the cruel truth of builders. Warriors are remembered for battles. Kings are remembered for reigns. But architects are remembered only through what still stands long after they're gone. And Luciano's structure still stands. Not with his name on it. Not with his face attached to it. But with his logic embedded in its bones. Lucky Luciano didn't die defeated. He died obsolete. And sometimes that is the highest price power demands. If there is one final lesson buried deep inside Lucky Luciano's life, it is this: systems outlive men, but they do not protect them. Luciano believed that if he could remove chaos from crime, he could escape its consequences. He believed structure would replace brutality, and intelligence would replace blood. And for a time, he was right. He avoided the fate that claimed so many others: no ambush, no public execution, no betrayal in the streets. But safety came at the cost of belonging. When Luciano looked back on his life, there was no moment he could return to and fix. Every decision he made was logical. Every move was calculated. The tragedy wasn't that he made mistakes. The tragedy was that he didn't. His vision worked exactly as intended. The world he built functioned perfectly without him, and that left him standing. Outside it, alive but irrelevant. Power usually ends in violence. Luciano's ended in exclusion. He wasn't overthrown. He wasn't replaced by a stronger man. He was quietly moved aside by time and efficiency. The younger bosses didn't fear him. They respected him the way people respect history, distantly, abstractly, without obligation. Respect without influence is another kind of prison. In the final years of his life, Luciano understood something most men never do. The greatest threat to power isn't enemies. It's success. When your ideas become permanent, you stop being necessary. When your system becomes standard, your presence becomes optional. Luciano had built something too perfect to need him, and that is why his story ends the way it does. Not with gunfire, not with headlines, but with a man standing alone in a foreign country, watching planes come and go, knowing the world he changed would never call him back. Lucky Luciano changed crime forever, and in return crime erased him quietly. By the time the world fully caught up to what Lucky Luciano had done, it was already too late to give him credit in any meaningful way. His name existed more as a footnote than a warning. Movies glamorized the loud ones, books celebrated the violent ones. Luciano remained in the background where he had always believed real power belonged. But there is a difference between choosing the shadows and being trapped in them. In his final years, Luciano lived a life stripped of extremes. No empires to run, no enemies to fear, no allies to impress, just routine, memory, and distance. The same mind that once calculated territories and alliances now played old conversations, old streets, old decisions. He had reshaped the criminal world, yet the criminal world no longer needed him to shape it. The silence he once used as a weapon had become his environment. And yet there is something almost hauntingly victorious about that. Luciano proved that the strongest influence doesn't need a throne. It doesn't need recognition. It doesn't even need survival. It only needs to work. Every time a criminal organization avoided war to protect profit, Luciano was there. Every time a leader stayed invisible to stay alive, Luciano was there. Every time crime chose structure over chaos, his shadow moved quietly through the decision. He paid for that influence with his identity. He became less a man and more a concept, less a ruler and more a rulebook. And rulebooks are never thanked. They are only followed. Lucky Luciano didn't die as a king, a martyr, or a villain. He died as a solution that had already been implemented. And that may be the most uncomfortable ending of all, because it means the world didn't defeat him. It absorbed him. He changed crime forever. And then, exactly as he designed it, crime went on without saying his name. In the end, Lucky Luciano's life closed the only way it ever could have. Quietly, no crowds, no speeches, no reckoning. Just a man whose greatest accomplishment ensured that he would never be needed again. History tends to remember those who burn brightly and collapse violently, but Luciano didn't burn. He engineered. He replaced chaos with systems, emotion with structure, tradition with efficiency. And systems don't mourn their creators. What makes his story linger is not what he gained, but what he surrendered. He gave up visibility to gain control. He gave up loyalty to gain stability. He gave up legacy to gain longevity. For a brief moment in history, he held more influence than almost any criminal before or after him. Yet he lived his final years watching that influence operate independently of him. That is a kind of loss most people never experience, and few would choose willingly. Lucky Luciano proved that power doesn't need noise, fear, or even fearlessness. It needs patience, intelligence, and restraint. But he also proved something darker, that when power becomes perfect, it no longer protects the person who created it. It simply continues, indifferent to who is standing beside it or left behind. He changed the rules, destroyed the old order, and built something that could survive any one man's downfall, including his own. And that is why his punishment wasn't death, prison, or betrayal. His punishment was watching the world he designed move forward without him. Lucky Luciano changed crime forever, and paid for it not in blood, but in silence.